The clinking of silverware and muted conversations formed the soundtrack of Ava Parker's life at the Copperfinch, an upscale diner that only sounded elegant. In reality, it smelled of burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant, and its chandeliers flickered like they were tired of pretending to be grand. Ava's movements were automatic. After 4 years of working here, she wore her practiced polite smile, poured refills without spilling a drop, and dodged wandering elbows in the narrow aisle between tables. To most customers, she was invisible, an extension of the coffee pot she carried, or the order pad she tucked into the pocket of her apron. At 24, her world was no bigger than her nightly walk home, the faded vinyl booth she claimed during breaks, and the cramped studio apartment she shared with her roommate, Mara, a nursing student. She juggled shifts and community college classes like someone running on muscle memory rather than hope. Each night, her feet ached, her wrists stiffened, and she would lie in bed staring at the stained ceiling, wondering if this was all life intended for her. But there was one thing about Ava that was not ordinary. Inside her right wrist, nestled beneath the cuff of her uniform sleeve, was a birthmark. A perfect crescent moon the color of pale coffee. She never showed it to anyone, not because it was ugly, but because it felt strangely intimate, like a secret. Her only claim to a past she could not remember. A past that was blank, except for a single line in her adoption papers. Found at St. Agnes Hospital, no known relatives. Most nights, the crescent meant nothing, just a quirk on her skin. But tonight it felt warm, like it was pulsing with her heartbeat. Ava ignored it, stacked plates, and balanced a tray of iced tea glasses on one arm. Table 6 asked for extra napkins. Table 9 wanted their soup reheated. Table 7, the new reservation had just been seated. She glanced at them only briefly as she passed. An older woman, elegant, silver hair, pearls at her throat, posture straight, despite her age. Beside her sat a man in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression calm but distant. Across from them lounged a younger man, probably late 20s, scrolling through his phone with a bored flick of his thumb. Wealth clung to them like a tailored scent, subtle but unmistakable. They did not belong among the weary shoppers and office clerks who usually ate here. Ava's shift was reaching that in-between moment, just after the dinner rush before the night stretch. She exhaled softly, refilled her coffee pot, and walked toward table 7. Her mind was already reciting the script. More coffee for anyone? Her smile soft, familiar. This was her life, a rhythm of footsteps, conversations, and quiet resignation. The world outside barely noticed her, and she had learned not to expect it to. Figuring anything extraordinary felt like staring at a closed door without a handle. Her birthmark throbbed again, faint but insistent. She rubbed her wrist absently beneath the sleeve and carried on. The copper light of the hanging lamps cast warm reflections on the polished wooden counters. The clock above the entrance read 7:02 p.m., a precise, unremarkable time. Ava did not know that in exactly 1 minute the quiet, predictable pattern of her life would be shattered. That someone from a world she had never touched would say her name, not out of annoyance or need, but out of recognition. Real or imagined did not matter. It would be enough to split open everything she thought she knew. For now, she simply poured water into a glass for table 4, smiled when they thanked her, and adjusted the collar of her uniform. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. Her shoes squeaked softly across the tile floor. Her breath made a faint cloud against the cold air leaking from the kitchen door. Outside, a wind was blowing leaves against the window pane. She did not see them. She did not see the older woman's eyes at table 7 watching her like someone seeing a ghost. She did not see the young man glance up annoyed, then freeze for a heartbeat before looking back down. She did not hear the barely audible inhale of the man in the suit. She saw none of it, not yet. She only heard the faint rustle of her apron and the whispered call from the hostess. "Stand by table 7, ready for service." Ava nodded, picked up the fresh pot of coffee, and turned. Her steps were steady, her smile untouched by destiny. The birthmark on her wrist pulsed once more like a warning or a promise. Ava approached table 7 with the fresh pot of coffee in her hand, steam curling gently from its spout. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, inhaled, and slipped into her customer voice, soft, polite, and practiced. "More coffee for anyone?" Her sleeve shifted just a little as she leaned forward to refill the older woman's cup, exposing the pale curve of skin at her wrist. It happened in an instant. A hand shot out faster than seemed possible for someone of such age. Thin fingers, cold and unyielding, clamped onto Ava's arm like iron. The coffee pot jerked in her other hand, nearly spilling its contents. Ava gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Every sound in the restaurant seemed to dim all at once, as though someone had placed a glass dome over her world. The older woman's eyes locked onto Ava's wrist, widened with something between disbelief and desperate hope. Her lips trembled. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, not with curiosity but with reverence, as if she had stumbled upon a relic from a dream. Her voice, though soft, cut straight through the murmur of conversation. Ava froze her entire body, going rigid. The hand on her wrist was cold, trembling, yet unrelenting. She tried to pull back gently, but the woman's grip tightened her knuckles, turning white. The coffee pot in Ava's other hand hovered dangerously close to the edge of the table, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shake the china. "Ma'am," Ava said quietly, struggling to keep her voice calm. "Could you please let go?" The elegant woman did not seem to hear her. She lifted Ava's arm, turning it so that the birthmark sat plainly in the light. Her breath hitched. "The crescent moon, it runs in our family." The words were not a question, they were a declaration. The younger man at the table, Lucas Whitfield, looked up from his phone, brow creasing with irritation. "Mother, for God's sake, let the girl go. You are making a scene." His tone was dismissive, his gaze flicking to Ava, as if she were little more than an unfortunate inconvenience. The man in the suit, Thomas Whitfield, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "Eleanor, please," he said, voice low, controlled but urgent. But the older woman Eleanor did not release Ava. Her eyes shone with tears that clung to the pale edges of her lashes. "This mark," she said, again her grip tightening. "My daughter Celeste had it. My mother before her. It is ours." A hush fell across the restaurant like a curtain. Forks paused in mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the ceiling fans seemed to spin more slowly. Ava's cheeks flamed with embarrassment. She wanted to shrink into the floor, disappear into the whir of kitchen doors and clatter of dishes. Instead, she stood under the weight of dozens of eyes, skin burning beneath Eleanor's touch. Thomas reached out gently but firmly, placing his hand over his mother's. "Eleanor, please, you're frightening her. Let her go." With a sudden breath, Eleanor blinked as though waking from a trance. Her grip loosened just enough. Ava pulled her arm back, stumbling one step, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The coffee pot clinked softly as she set it down on an empty table. "I'm sorry," Ava murmured, though she wasn't sure why she was the one apologizing. "I think you're mistaken." "No," Eleanor said, voice cracking but full of conviction. "I know that mark. I would know it anywhere." Lucas stood tossing a $100 bill onto the table as if it were an exasperated period. "We are leaving," he said through clenched teeth. "Grandmother is not well. Come." Eleanor resisted slightly, eyes still fixed on Ava. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Celeste." Her name was Celeste. Thomas paused, torn between duty and devastation. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a business card, scribbled something on its back, then pressed it gently into Ava's hand. "I apologize for all of this," he said, voice low. "My mother has never recovered from losing my sister. I would be grateful if you might call me so we can speak calmly. No obligations." Ava stared down at the card, thick white cardstock. Thomas Whitfield, CEO, Whitfield Industries. A handwritten number beneath. She looked up. Lucas's glare hardened into something like warning. Thomas's eyes held apology. Eleanor's held something altogether different. Hope. Wild, fragile hope. As they left, whispers erupted around her like ripples across water. Ava stood motionless, the business card warm against her palm. The birthmark on her wrist no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a spotlight. And somewhere in the quiet corner of her mind, a thought trembled. The business card sat on the chipped surface of Ava's kitchen table like a dare. She had placed it there the moment she came home from the Copper Finch, and it had not moved since. It was too clean, too elegant for this place. Whitfield Industries embossed in black, and beneath it, a number written in steady, careful handwriting. Thomas Whitfield. Ava stood by the window, arms folded. Outside, the city breathed in its usual way. Neon lights flickered. A siren wailed in the distance. None of it felt real to her anymore. Her wrist still tingled where Eleanor Whitfield had touched her, the memory of that iron-cold grip replaying over and over in her mind. "You're quiet," Mara said around a mouthful of cereal. Her roommate sat cross-legged on a stool, still in her scrubs from nursing school. "What's with the dramatic stare? Did someone forget to tip again?" Ava didn't answer. She just nodded toward the table. Mara followed her gaze, spotted the card, and nearly dropped her spoon. "Oh, is that from the table, 7 people? You actually took it? Holy crap, that's like billionaire stuff." "They're not billionaires," Ava muttered, though she was not entirely sure. It doesn't matter. They were just intense. "Intense?" Mara repeated, raising a brow. "That woman grabbed you in front of everyone. I heard Jenna say she cried Celeste and fainted into her soup. I assume that's exaggerated, but still." Ava exhaled slowly and pulled out a chair. The legs scraped the linoleum floor. She sat down, hands pressed against her temples. "She told me this birthmark runs in their family. Said her daughter had it, Celeste." Mara blinked. "And you, what did you say? That she was wrong?" Ava's voice was flat, but her fingers drifted unconsciously to her wrist, brushing against the fabric, hiding the crescent moon. "But I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I close my eyes, her face is right there. Like she was looking at me and seeing someone else." Mara leaned forward, propping her chin on her hand. "You should call him." Ava's head snapped up. "Call him? Why?" "Because this is literally the plot of a movie," Mara said, gesturing broadly with her spoon. "Rich, mysterious family, secret birthmark, long-lost heiress. Worst-case scenario, you get a weird story and maybe free lunch. Best-case scenario." Mara's eyes widened. "You are secretly royalty." Ava laughed, but it came out thin and tired. "That's ridiculous." "Is it though?" Mara asked genuinely. "You're an orphan. You've never known where you came from. What if this is something?" Ava stared at the card. The neat black letters seemed to stare back. Whitfield Celeste. The way Eleanor had whispered that name as if it were a prayer. "It's probably just a coincidence," Ava said, but her voice was barely above a whisper. Mara smiled gently. "Maybe, but doesn't some part of you want to know Ava's silence was answer enough?" The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking seconds she could never get back. Ava reached out tentatively, fingers brushing the card. The embossing was smooth under her thumb. She turned it over. The handwritten number glared up at her like a question. She pulled her hand back sharply, as if it had burned her. "What am I supposed to even say?" Ava muttered. "Hi, you don't know me, but your mother thinks I'm her granddaughter." "Yes," Mara said, nodding enthusiastically. "Exactly like that, but maybe with less panic in your voice." Ava stood abruptly, the chair legs screeching. "I can't. I don't want money. I don't want drama. I just want my life back." Mara's expression softened. "And what if your life was never what you thought it was?" The room fell quiet. Night deepened outside. The hum of traffic became a lullaby. Ava remained frozen, staring at the card like it might leap off the table and demand an answer. Minutes passed. Then slowly, carefully, she reached for her phone. Her hand hovered over the keypad. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She looked at Mara. "If this goes horribly wrong, you're explaining it at my funeral," she muttered. Mara grinned. "Deal." Ava inhaled deeply, dialed the number and pressed call. One ring, two, three. A familiar calm voice answered, Thomas Whitfield speaking. Ava opened her mouth, but for a moment no words came. Mr. Whitfield, this is Ava Parker from the restaurant. There was a pause, then his voice softened. Thank you for calling, truly. Ava swallowed. I just want to understand. Of course, he said. Would you join us for lunch this Saturday at our home? No obligations.
You deserve answers. Ava's fingers tightened around the phone. The birthmark on her wrist pulsed. Okay, she said quietly. Saturday. She hung up. The card still lay on the table, but it no longer felt like a question. It felt like the beginning of an answer she wasn't sure she wanted. Saturday arrived with a pale gray sky and a chill that clung to the air. Ava stood on the cracked sidewalk outside her building, clutching a small bag and wondering for the 100th time if she should turn back. But before she could decide, a sleek black sedan glided to the curb. The driver stepped out, crisp suit, polished shoes, and opened the rear door as if she were someone important. Miss Parker, he said with a slight nod, we've been expecting you. The ride was silent, except for the soft hum of the engine. The city slowly melted away, replaced by rolling hills, tall iron gates, and long, winding roads lined with ancient oaks. When the car finally turned up a stone driveway, Ava felt her breath catch. The Whitfield estate didn't look real. It was a sprawling manor of pale sandstone and dark slate roofs, with ivy curling around its walls like veins. Tall windows reflected the gray morning light, giving the house a watchful expression. Thomas Whitfield was waiting at the entrance, dressed in a simple charcoal sweater, not a suit this time. He offered a polite, reassuring smile. Ava, thank you for coming. We're grateful. Ava managed a nod. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stepped inside. The foyer was vast, the ceiling high enough to swallow echoes. A marble floor stretched beneath her feet, polished to a mirror sheen. Oil portraits lined the walls, stern-faced ancestors with eyes that seemed to follow her every move. At the center of the hall hung a massive chandelier, glittering like frozen starlight. Please, this way, Thomas said, leading her through a corridor where sunlight spilled across patterned rugs and dark oak paneling. He spoke gently, pointing out rooms as they passed, the library, the music room, the conservatory, but Ava barely heard him. Her eyes kept flicking to the portraits, names engraved on brass plates. Whitfield, 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 a lineage carved in stone and canvas. They reached a sunroom flooded with soft winter light. Eleanor Whitfield sat in a velvet armchair, a plaid blanket draped across her knees. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, but her face was tired, fragile. Yet when she saw Ava, her eyes brightened, with a hope so raw it made Ava's chest tighten. Ava, my dear child, thank you for coming. Her voice trembled as she reached out a thin hand. Standing by the fireplace was Lucas, arms folded, gaze sharp and unreadable. He didn't speak, but his eyes said enough. Suspicion, irritation, a hint of warning. Ava took a cautious step inside. The scent of roses drifted in from the garden beyond the glass walls. Everything was too still, too perfect. Please sit. Thomas gestured to a white sofa across from Eleanor. Ava sat on the edge, back straight, palms pressed against her knees. Her eyes drifted once more to the paintings in the hallway. The largest portrait just outside the door, a stern man with cold dark eyes and a rigid jaw. Gregory Whitfield. Her stomach knotted. Eleanor's voice pulled her back. I know this must feel strange, but I must ask you about your birth, about your life. Ava hesitated. I don't know much, she said quietly. I was left at a hospital, no name, no family. Eleanor's eyes shimmered. A baby, alone, just like I feared. Lucas scoffed, softly breaking the moment. Or it's just a coincidence, he said, his tone smooth but edged. A foundling with a matching mark. Convenient. Ava flinched. Eleanor's hand tightened on the armrest. Lucas, that's enough. No mother. Someone has to say it. Lucas stepped forward, jaw clenched. We know nothing about her. She could have found out about Celeste. She could have tattooed that mark. Ava's breath caught. She stared at him, disbelief flaring into anger. It's not a tattoo.
Thomas moved between them, calm but firm. "Lucas, sit down." Lucas didn't. His gaze stayed locked on Ava. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly. "What do you want from us?" "Nothing," Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want your money or your name." Eleanor leaned forward, desperate. "We only want to know the truth, if there's even a chance you are my granddaughter." Thomas nodded. "There is a way to find out, scientifically. A DNA test." Ava blinked. "A test?" "Yes," Thomas said gently. "We can compare your DNA to mine. If you are Celeste's daughter, the similarity will be clear." Eleanor clasped her hands together, eyes shining with fragile hope. "Please say yes." Ava looked at each of them. Eleanor's trembling hands, Lucas's cold disbelief, Thomas's quiet resolve. Her heart pounded. The birthmark on her wrist seemed to burn. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll do it." A faint pulse of relief moved through the room. Outside, the clouds shifted, letting a sliver of pale sunlight fall across the glass. But Ava didn't see the light. Her gaze lingered on the portrait in the hall. Gregory Whitfield watching from the shadows. The test would tell the truth, whatever it was. The nurse arrived at Ava's apartment on Tuesday morning, carrying a small black case and an air of quiet efficiency. Mara hovered in the doorway, still in her pajamas, wide-eyed, as if witnessing a medical scene from a drama. Ava sat at the kitchen table, hands curled tightly in her lap, while the nurse explained the procedure. "Just a simple buccal swab," she said gently, "a soft brush inside the cheek, no pain." Ava nodded, though her throat felt tight. She opened her mouth, and the swab touched the inside of her cheek, gentle, precise. It took only seconds, yet it felt like something irreversible was being taken from her, like she had offered a piece of herself she could never reclaim. The nurse sealed the swab into a small sterile tube, labeled it with Ava's name and a barcode, then placed it carefully into the case beside another tube, Thomas Whitfield's sample already waiting. Mara leaned in, whispering, "Is this real life?" Ava could only manage a quiet, "I guess so." The nurse gave a polite smile. "I will deliver these directly to the lab. Results should take about a week." She handed Ava a simple form to sign, then closed her case and left with soft footsteps. As soon as the door clicked shut, Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Mara flopped onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. "A week," she said. "It feels like 100 years." For Ava, days blurred together. She returned to work at the Copper Finch, but the customers' faces were a haze, and the orders slipped from her memory like water through her fingers. She poured coffee, answered questions, nodded when spoken to, but inside her thoughts were a tangled storm of maybes. What if it was true? What if it wasn't? What if she didn't belong anywhere at all? Every night she touched the birthmark on her wrist, tracing the crescent shape with her fingertip. Mara tried to keep her grounded, bringing her takeout food, reminding her to sleep, making jokes that were half sincere, half terrified. "You know, if you turn out to be Princess of Connecticut or whatever, I expect a job at the castle." But beneath the jokes, Mara watched her with concern. Ava smiled less, slept poorly, flinched when someone mentioned the Whitfields. Even the sunlight streaming through their small window felt different, sharper somehow, like the world was waiting for an answer. Across town at the Whitfield estate, the atmosphere had shifted too. Eleanor Whitfield spent hours in the sunroom, staring out at the frozen garden, murmuring to herself about Celeste. Thomas checked his phone obsessively, waiting for a call from the lab. Lucas avoided the house altogether, attending meetings and coming home past midnight, but not before making a quiet visit to the university campus. He spoke with Professor Strauss from the genetics department, asking questions about DNA tests, false positives, birthmarks, inheritance. His voice was steady, but his eyes held storm clouds. A week passed, then another day, then one more. On Friday evening, Thomas called. Ava was at home, sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through old textbooks when her phone buzzed. Her stomach tightened the moment she saw his name. She answered with a tentative, "Hello." "The results come tomorrow morning," Thomas said. His voice was calm, but there was a strain beneath it. My mother would like you to be with us when we open them. I understand if that is too much to ask. Ava didn't speak for a heartbeat. Her chest rose and fell slowly. I'll come, she said finally. Saturday morning dawned cold and clear. Frost glazed the sidewalks like thin glass as Ava stepped into the black sedan waiting outside. The ride to the estate felt longer this time, every turn in the road echoing with her doubts. She held her hands tightly in her lap, thumb brushing the edge of her birthmark for comfort. Thomas met her at the door, his expression unreadable but kind. "Thank you for being here," he said. Eleanor was waiting in the sunroom, pale but composed, hands folded in her lap like a prayer. Lucas stood by the window, arms crossed, gaze dark, but quieter than before. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. "The test results will arrive by email any moment," Thomas said, placing his laptop on the table. "I have the password from the lab." Ava sat, her pulse drumming in her ears. Eleanor whispered, barely audible, "Whatever the truth, thank you for coming into our lives." A chime, an email. The subject line, "Lab results, Whitfield case." Thomas opened it. The screen glowed in the winter light. For a breathless moment, no one moved. The truth was waiting behind a single click. Thomas clicked the file. The lab report unfolded across the screen in stark black letters, clinical and cold. Lines of data, genetic markers, reference numbers. Ava understood none of it until her eyes dropped to the final sentence, printed at the bottom of the page, bold and undeniable. Probability of biological relationship between Thomas Whitfield and Ava Parker, 0%. The words didn't echo, they landed heavy, absolute. Thomas's face went still, his lips parting slightly, as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Eleanor's hands clutched the armrests of her chair, her eyes wide and desperately searching Thomas's face for a different truth. Lucas didn't move at first, just stared, then a single quiet exhale slid from between his teeth, a sound like satisfaction, curdled into anger. "No," Eleanor whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no. That's not right." She pushed herself forward, her frail frame trembling. "Read it again. You must have read it wrong. Please read it again." Thomas's voice broke as he whispered, "I did." The air in the sunroom cracked like ice, sinking into silence. Ava sat perfectly still. Her heart didn't race, it went silent. A deep numbness spread through her like winter wind. She had prepared herself for this moment, told herself it was likely, but the certainty, the absolute zero pressed down like a weight she hadn't known existed. Lucas stepped forward, his voice quiet but edged with cold steel. "I told you, from the beginning. I told you this was ridiculous, that it was a lie." Eleanor didn't even look at him. Her gaze was fixed on Ava, grief spilling across her features. "I know what I saw," she said, voice breaking. "The birthmark, the eyes, I felt it. Birthmarks don't make family." Lucas shot back. "DNA does, and hers doesn't match." Ava stood slowly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "I never said I was her granddaughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never asked for anything. I told you it was probably just a coincidence." Lucas laughed once, sharp and humorless. "A convenient coincidence." He stepped closer, eyes hard. "You show up with a perfect story, a perfect mark, and you expect us to believe you didn't want anything?" Eleanor gasped. "Lucas, stop this at once. She's done nothing wrong." But Lucas's gaze was on Ava, sharp, relentless. "How much did you think you could get?" he asked softly. "Money? A name? A legacy?" Thomas's eyes flashed. "Lucas, that is enough." "No, it isn't," Lucas snapped. "I want her to admit it. Admit this was a performance." Ava's fingers curled into fists at her sides. Her blood pulsed in her ears. Her voice trembled when she spoke, but it did not break. "I didn't lie. I didn't know who you were. I didn't want your money. I still don't." "Then leave," Lucas said quietly. "Leave and don't come back." Eleanor's voice cracked into a cry. Lucas Thomas moved quickly, stepping between them, his voice low and sharp with command. "That is enough. Apologize to her, now." Lucas's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. His eyes said everything. Ava swallowed her throat tight. "It's all right," she said, though it clearly wasn't. "I think I should go." Thomas turned to her, his expression pained. "Ava, Please let me offer compensation for everything we have put you through. It was wrong of us to involve you so deeply." Ava shook her head. "I don't want your money, Mr. Whitfield." Eleanor tried to stand, reaching out a trembling hand. "Ava, wait, please." But Ava stepped back. "Thank you for being kind to me," she said softly to Eleanor. "I'm sorry it wasn't what you hoped." The room blurred around her as she turned and walked out, past the white sofa, past the portraits of the Whitfield ancestors that no longer meant anything. Her footsteps echoed through the marble hallway, her vision sharp with unshed tears. Outside, the air was cold and raw, the sky heavy with gray clouds. She started down the long driveway alone, no car waiting this time. Each step was steady, though her chest ached as if something inside her had cracked. Behind her, inside the sunroom, Eleanor collapsed into her chair, silent tears streaming down her face. Thomas stood frozen, guilt hollowing his features. Lucas turned away, jaw tight, arms crossed like armor. Ava did not look back. The world had not ended, but something in her world had. 0%, not almost, not maybe, nothing. And yet, it hurt as if she had lost something she never truly had. The days that followed were not loud. They did not explode with anger or tears or anything dramatic. They sank quietly, the way a stone drops through water, disappearing into a dark stillness no one sees. Ava moved through them like a ghost, hollow but breathing. She returned to the copper finch, her apron tied around her waist, like a reminder of who she was supposed to be. But now, every familiar sound felt foreign. The hiss of the coffee machine, the scrape of forks, the murmurs of strangers. Eyes followed her, not with pity exactly, but with the kind of curiosity reserved for disasters that happened just out of sight. She heard whispers. Celeste. Birthmark. Imposter. Scam. Some people were kind, most were careful. All of them looked. Mr. Patel, the manager, gave her back her job, but not his trust. "You understand why I must ask these questions," he said, hovering awkwardly in his office doorway. "Did you plan any of this? Did you tell them anything personal?" Ava just stared at him until his voice faltered. She shook her head once, then walked out before he could finish apologizing. At night, she lay awake in the small apartment, listening to Mara breathing softly in the bed across the room. Mara tried to prowl around her with jokes and takeout and late-night movies, but nothing stuck. Ava would smile, but it stayed only on her lips. Inside, a dull ache pulsed behind her ribs, slow and deep. The birthmark on her wrist no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a joke. Across the hills in the Whitfield estate, silence had a different weight. It hung heavy in the sunroom, where Eleanor sat day after day, staring through the glass at the frost-bitten roses. She no longer spoke of Celeste. She no longer spoke at all. The hope that had briefly lit her face was gone. Her hands sat limp in her lap, like she had forgotten they could move. Thomas buried himself in work, but numbers and meetings could not cover the guilt that stained every memory of Ava's face in the moment she walked away. At night he stood before his father's portrait in the study, searching for answers in painted eyes that offered none. He spoke once to the empty air. "I failed her. I failed all of them." But the silence only deepened. Lucas avoided home whenever he could, but no matter where he went, the memory of his own voice tearing into Ava followed him like a shadow. In the quiet moments, it echoed mean and unforgivable. He told himself he had only protected his family. Yet he could not forget the look on her face when she said, "I never asked for any of this." That look haunted him more than her words. At the estate, Eleanor's health began to falter. She ate little, slept less. Servants whispered. Thomas called doctors. They spoke gently about grief, about shock, about hearts that endured too much and broke quietly. Thomas sat beside his mother's chair one evening, holding her thin hand. She whispered without looking at him. She had her eyes, Thomas, Celeste's eyes, and then said nothing more. In the apartment, Mara found Ava sitting at the kitchen table one early morning, staring at the business card she had torn in half, then taped back together. Coffee went cold in front of her. Mara said, "You can't keep bleeding over people who don't even see you anymore." Ava didn't answer. For a long time, she didn't even blink. Then quietly she said, "I thought for a moment, just a moment, that I belonged somewhere." Mara reached across the table, touched her hand. "You still do, just not there." Ava nodded, but did not look convinced. Winter crept in fully, the air sharpened, trees turned to silhouettes against steel-gray skies. Life went on in small ways, bills paid, shifts covered, exams passed. But something invisible had cracked inside all of them. A fracture no one knew how to mend. And yet beneath it all, under the quiet ache of disappointment, something unresolved stirred, like a faint pulse in the dark. Not hope, not yet. Just a question that refused to die. If it was not true, then why had it felt so real? That question followed Ava in her dreams, where she saw the sunroom, the portrait-lined halls, the way Eleanor had spoken. Celeste like a prayer, it followed Thomas through long sleepless nights, whispering that answers did not lie in numbers, but in the past. It followed Lucas in silence, refusing to let him forget the ugliness of his own certainty. The truth was not finished with them, not yet. Rain hammered against the tall windows of the Whitfield estate as night settled like a heavy coat across the hills. Thomas stood alone in his late father's study, hands buried in his pockets, the crackle of the fireplace the only sound. He had wandered here without thinking, searching for something to distract him from the echoing emptiness that filled the house. Books lined the walls, leather spines untouched for years. Dust hung in the air like a memory. His gaze drifted to the far corner, where a carved wooden chest sat half hidden by shadow. It had always been there, an heirloom no one touched, locked and silent. It had belonged to Gregory Whitfield, a man whose presence lingered in the house like a ghost. Thomas stared at it for a long moment. Then, for the first time in his life, he crossed the room, knelt and curled his fingers around the iron latch. It clicked open. The lid rose with a long creak. The smell of old paper and cedar drifted into the air. Inside were rows of neatly stacked ledgers, business contracts, letters sealed in fading envelopes. Beneath them, a smaller tin box tied with a faded red ribbon. Thomas hesitated, his breath shallow. Then he untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Letters, dozens of them, folded carefully, yellowed with age. Ink faded, but legible. His heart thudded unevenly. He unfolded the first one. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and painfully familiar. October 12th, Anna. He found my last letter. Father, I mean. He didn't yell. That was worse. He said he would rather see me locked away than let me ruin the family name. He has barred the gates and taken the telephone. I smuggled this out through Mrs. Keene in the kitchen. Daniel says we should run. I am terrified. Celeste. The paper trembled in Thomas's hand. He read another, then another. Each one was a cry written in ink, stories of desperation and control, of Gregory's rage and Celeste's fear. She wrote of Ethan Cole, the quiet artist who loved her not for the Whitfield name, but for her music, for the crescent birthmark on her wrist that he traced gently when the world became too much. The letters painted a picture Thomas had never seen, not a reckless runaway, but a prisoner. One letter was stained as if with tears. November 3rd, Anna. If you ever read this, I may already be gone. We will leave tonight. Daniel says it must look like I died, or Father will hunt us to the ends of the earth. A car accident in a distant town. They will find someone else's body. I hate it. I hate lying, but I love him and I love this baby. Yes, Anna, a baby. I am carrying a little life, a little crescent moon. I will keep her safe, even if it means she never knows my name. Thomas lowered the letter, his vision blurring. He stood and stumbled to the fireplace, letters still in hand. His chest burned with something sharp. Guilt, anger, heartbreak. All his life he had believed Celeste had abandoned them. In truth, she had been escaping. He ran a hand through his hair, walked to his mother's portrait and paused. Then he turned, not toward Eleanor but toward the door. He needed to find Ava. It took almost 2 days to track her down. She had left her apartment, gone from the Copper Finch, no forwarding address. But Thomas was a Whitfield, and Whitfields did not lose people easily. A private investigator found her at a rundown apartment complex near the railway lines carrying a laundry basket, her eyes shadowed but alive. She froze when she saw him, her arms tightened around the basket like a shield. "What do you want?" Thomas breathed in slowly, rain dripping from his coat. "To tell you the truth, about Celeste, about everything." She did not move, but she did not walk away. Thomas opened the tin box. He didn't hand it to her. He read from it. Letters filled the cold parking lot with a voice long gone but suddenly alive again. Celeste's fear, her love, her pregnancy, the escape, the reason. When he finished, Ava stood very still. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her wrist, brushing the crescent moon. "And the DNA test," she whispered. "If she was your sister, why?" Thomas looked up. She wasn't. Not entirely. Celeste was my sister in name, but my father wasn't her father. Silence settled like rain. Thomas held Ava's gaze. "I am asking you to come back with me. Not for the fortune, not for us, but for her, for Celeste." Ava's pulse thundered in her ears. Slowly, she nodded. She would go back to the house that broke her, not for answers, for truth. The sun had barely risen when the car carrying Ava and Thomas turned into the Whitfield estate. The iron gates creaked open, as if awakened from a long sleep, and the gravel crunched softly beneath the tires. Ava sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, the tin box of letters resting between them. She did not look out the window. She did not need to. The long tree-lined road, the looming mansion, the chill in the air, she remembered it all. Inside the house, silence hung heavy like fog. Eleanor sat in the sunroom, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes unfocused. Nathan stood near the doorway, tense, as if guarding what remained of his grandmother's dignity. When he saw Ava, he moved instinctively in front of Eleanor, his jaw tight. "You should not be here," he said quietly, more shaken than angry. Thomas pushed the door open wider. "She is here because she deserves the truth," he said, and his voice carried a gravity that stilled the room. Eleanor looked up at last, her gaze trembling when it landed on Ava. Not anger, not rejection, only a sorrow as deep as winter. Thomas approached his mother slowly, the box of letters in his hands. "Mother," he said, "their father was not Celeste's father." Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. With trembling hands, Thomas opened the box and placed the first letter on her lap. "Read it," he whispered, "or let me read it for you." For a moment, Eleanor did not move. Then she nodded once, faintly. Thomas began to read. The words of Celeste filled the sunroom like ghosts come to life. She spoke of fear, of love, of an unborn child with a crescent birthmark. As each page turned, Eleanor's shoulders seemed to sink further, her composure unraveling thread by thread. When he reached the final letter, Eleanor let out a sound that was neither a sob nor a scream, but something in between raw and ancient. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips, tears spilling through her fingers. "I knew," she said, finally, in a voice barely more than a breath. "I knew he hated her, but I did not know this. I did not know she was afraid. I did not know she was pregnant." Her hands clutched the letter, crumpling the edges. "I could have saved her. I should have saved her." Nathan stood silent, his confidence shattered. His grandfather, once a monument in his memory, now stood exposed as a tyrant. He looked at Ava and his voice broke. "I was wrong about you. I am sorry, truly." Ava's throat tightened, but she said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on Eleanor, the woman who had first called her family, then cast her out in silence. Eleanor lifted her gaze towards Ava, her eyes swollen with tears. "That birthmark," she whispered. "I told myself it was ours, a Whitfield legacy, but it was never ours. It was his, hers, yours." The truth settled like dust in sunlight, clear, undeniable. Thomas stepped forward gently. "There is one more thing we must do. The DNA test must be done again, but this time with you, Mother." Eleanor closed her eyes as if bracing for a wave. Then she nodded. "If this is the truth, we will face it together." The days that followed were a quiet waiting, filled with broken apologies and hesitant conversations. Nathan found himself standing beside Ava more often than apart, speaking gently, asking about her life, her dreams. Thomas stayed close to Eleanor, who spent hours in the sunroom, fingers brushing over Celeste's letters as though trying to memorize the way her daughter once felt. Ava was given a room overlooking the gardens, though she wandered the mansion, unable to rest. She paused often beneath the portrait gallery where Whitfield ancestors stared down from the walls in oil and gold frames. One night she stood there alone, her reflection flickering in the glass. For the first time she noticed a faint crack through the portrait of Gregory Whitfield, as though the house itself rejected his legacy. On the morning the results arrived, the family gathered in the sunroom. No servants, no formalities, only fragile breath and beating hearts. Thomas opened the email on his laptop, turned the screen toward them. There at the bottom of the page the words were clear. Maternal match. Eleanor Whitfield is the biological grandmother of Ava Carter. Probability 99.999%. Eleanor covered her mouth, a sob escaping her as she reached toward Ava. "My granddaughter," she whispered, voice trembling like a prayer. "My Celeste's child." Ava stepped forward, tears blurring her vision. She knelt beside Eleanor, took her hands, and for the first time, did not pull away. Thomas stood behind them, silent, his eyes shining. Nathan moved closer, resting a hand on his grandmother's shoulder, his gaze steady on Ava, not with doubt but with recognition. The house stood still as if listening, portraits, silent witnesses. The lies were gone, the truth unburied, and in their place something fragile and new began to take root. A family not built on names or bloodlines alone, but on truth, pain, and the courage to face both. In the days following the revelation, the Whitfield estate seemed to breathe differently. Doors that had long stayed closed stood ajar. Voices that had once echoed with restraint now carried softness or sorrow. Yet, beneath the quiet, a tremor ran through every hallway, like something fragile trying to knit itself back together. Ava remained in the guest suite overlooking the gardens, though it felt less like a room and more like a waiting place. At night, she lay awake, listening to the wind scrape across the windows, wondering if she truly belonged, or if this was another dream ready to vanish at dawn. Each morning brought the memory of Eleanor clutching her hand, whispering, "Granddaughter." Yet doubt still gnawed at her like a stubborn shadow. Eleanor hardly left the sunroom. She sat in her armchair wrapped in a faded shawl, letters folded gently in her lap. Sometimes she would read them again, whispering Celeste's name, as though it kept her daughter alive. Other times, she stared out at the roses, her eyes reflecting something too deep for words. Guilt clung to her like frost. She had allowed silence to swallow truth, and now truth had returned, demanding its due. Thomas took charge quietly. He met with legal advisors in the study, speaking of estates, trusts, and bloodlines. He paced the marble floors late into the night, the weight of lineage pressing on his shoulders. It was not the fortune that troubled him, but the legacy of lies his father had left behind. He wanted to rebuild something honest, but did not yet know how. Nathan wandered restlessly from room to room, no longer the arrogant skeptic, but a young man stripped of certainty. One evening he knocked hesitantly on Ava's door. She opened it slowly. Neither spoke at first. Finally he said, "I owe you more apologies than I can count. I was cruel because I was afraid you were a lie, afraid you were the truth." Ava did not answer right away, but the hardness in her gaze softened just a little. They walked the quiet halls together, passing portraits of ancestors whose faces seemed to watch with cold indifference. When they paused before Gregory Whitfield's towering portrait, Nathan shook his head. "Everything I believed about him, everything he taught father to value, it was all built on control and pride." Ava looked at the painted eyes, harsh and unyielding, and whispered, "Then let it end with us." The next morning, Thomas gathered them all in the library. Sunlight spilled across the wooden table, casting long shadows across the letters spread neatly before them. "This house," he said, "has been ruled by silence for too long. Celeste tried to escape it. We must do more than escape. We must change it." Eleanor lifted her eyes, red-rimmed but resolute. "Then let us begin." They talked for hours, not about inheritance or titles, but about truth, about how to honor Celeste's memory, not with wealth, but with honesty and choice. Eleanor spoke haltingly of the man she had loved before Gregory, a quiet painter with kind eyes and a crescent mark just like Ava's. His name was Samuel Green. She told them how he had left before Thomas was born, how Gregory had discovered her secret and chained her life with shame. Her confession hung heavy, but no one looked away. Later, Ava walked alone into the old music room, a place she had never entered before. Dust coated the piano keys, and a cracked photograph of Celeste rested on the mantel, her smile untamed and bright. Ava touched the picture gently, her fingers trembling. "Mother," she whispered, testing the word on her tongue. It felt fragile but real. Nathan found her there quietly. "Would you like to hear something strange?" he asked. "I remember being little and overhearing grandmother humming. Someone asked her the melody. She said it was Celeste's. I think this house has been singing her name for years, waiting for someone to answer." Ava sat at the piano, pressing one key, then another. The melody came slowly, uncertain, but then clearer, like a memory resurfacing. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills, bathing the manor in amber light. Eleanor stood at the window, watching them, her heart aching but alive. Thomas stepped beside her, silent but steady. For the first time in years, she felt something she could not name. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. Night fell. The wind whispered through the halls, no longer a lament, but a promise. The Whitfield name had been fractured, but in its breaking, something truer was forming. Not built by pride or fear, but by those brave enough to hold both pain and hope in the same hand. And somewhere deep within the house, beneath portraits and echoes, a new foundation began to settle. Morning light filtered through gauze curtains, casting pale gold across the polished oak floors of the Whitfield estate. The air felt changed, softer somehow, as if the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. The storm had passed, but what remained was not silence, it was possibility. Ava rose early, waking from dreams filled with faces she'd never known, yet somehow remembered. She stood before the mirror, fingers brushing the small crescent moon on her wrist. It no longer felt like a symbol of isolation, but a thread linking her to a past both tragic and courageous. She whispered her mother's name, Celeste, and for the first time it did not hurt to say it. Downstairs, Eleanor waited in the sunroom, not with grief, but with a fragile kind of determination. She had written a letter, her handwriting shaky but deliberate. It was addressed to the trustees of the Whitfield Foundation. Thomas sat beside her, calm, serious, ready to support her. "I want it all changed," Eleanor said quietly. "No more statues, no more scholarships in Gregory's name. It should be Celeste's foundation now, for those who are unheard, unseen." Thomas nodded. "Then that is what it will be." Ava entered the room, Nathan following a respectful distance behind. Eleanor stood slowly, her aged hands trembling. "My granddaughter," she said, voice trembling like a candle flame. "I cannot undo the past, but I will not let you walk into the future alone." Ava hesitated just a moment, then walked into her grandmother's embrace. The hug was gentle, not desperate as it once was, but steady, like a promise. Later, they gathered for breakfast in the small dining room, not the grand hall of cold marble, but a sunlit corner filled with the scent of bread and tea. It felt ordinary in the best way. There were no servants hovering, no gold cutlery, just Eleanor, Thomas, Nathan, and Ava sitting around a wooden table. The conversation was quiet, awkward at times, but real. Nathan watched Ava closely, still haunted by the cruelty of his past words. When Eleanor left the room for a moment, he leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I hope someday I can earn your trust." Ava studied his face, saw no arrogance, only regret. "Trust is not given," she replied softly. "It is built, brick by brick." He nodded, like someone accepting a sentence he was willing to serve. That afternoon, Thomas and Ava walked the grounds. The sky was clear, the winter frost melting into glistening beads on the grass. Thomas carried a small leather book, Celeste's journal found folded beneath the letters. He handed it to Ava. "This belongs to you," he said. She opened it slowly, pages filled with music sketches and words her mother had written in secret. There were drawings of a baby, a tiny hand, a crescent moon. Ava pressed the book to her chest, eyes stinging with tears. As dusk fell, the family gathered in the portrait gallery. The towering images of Whitfield ancestors gazed down, solemn and distant. Gregory's portrait dominated the center, dark eyes, full of pride. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice clear. "This is not who we are anymore." Thomas nodded. "Workers will come tomorrow. The portrait will be taken down. In its place, Celeste's painting will hang, the one Samuel Green painted before she left." Ava glanced at the empty space on the opposite wall, where a blank frame now leaned, ready to be filled. Nathan surprised them by stepping forward. "If we do this, it is more than a gesture," he said. "It is a declaration that truth matters more than appearance, family more than lineage." Eleanor reached for his hand. He took it. Later, Ava stood alone in the rose garden, cold wind brushing her hair. The estate glowed with warm lamplight behind her. She looked up to the stars and wondered if somewhere her mother was watching. The pain remained, but it no longer consumed her. She had a name, a family, a place to begin. Footsteps approached. Nathan stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. "Beautiful night," he murmured. She nodded. Quiet stretched between them, not uncomfortable. After a moment, he said softly, "Ava, you don't have to stay, but I hope you will. Not because of blood or inheritance, but because this place needs someone who sees it clearly." She turned to him, saw sincerity, not expectation. "I will stay for a while," she said, "but not for the house, for the people inside it." Inside, the windows glowed like lanterns in the dark. Somewhere a piano played softly, an echo of Celeste's melody rising through the halls. A new dawn was coming, not loud or sudden, but gentle, like morning light, spreading across rooms long kept in shadow, and for the first time since she was a child, Ava did not feel alone. Spring arrived quietly, and with it a softness the Whitfield estate had not known in years. Snow melted from the stone balustrades, revealing the first shoots of green beneath. Sun warmed the glass of the conservatory, coaxing pale blossoms from the sleeping roses. For the first time in a long time, the house did not feel haunted, it felt awake. Ava stood in the garden early one morning, listening to the birdsong that drifted from the trees. Her breath clouded faintly in the cool air, but her heart felt warm. She no longer carried her suitcase from room to room like a guest afraid to settle. She had unpacked. She had stayed. Sometimes she still woke in the night, unsure of the walls around her, but the fear no longer held. She was no longer a visitor. She was part of the story. Inside, Eleanor sat at her writing desk, sunlight falling across her shoulders. She composed a speech to deliver at the reopening of the foundation. No longer the Gregory Whitfield Trust, but the Celeste Green Foundation. Her pen paused often, her hands trembling, but the words came. It would be a place for artists, for mothers without voices, for children left behind, as Ava had been. It was not penance, it was love made into something living. Thomas moved steadily through the house, clearing rooms that had been locked for decades, unrolling blueprints for repairs. He spoke with Ava often, asking her opinion on music rooms and art wings, and whether Celeste's paintings should hang in the East Hall or the library. He no longer saw her as a question to be answered. She was the answer they had all been missing. Nathan changed in quieter ways. He no longer avoided mirrors or speaking his truth. He walked beside Ava through corridors no longer heavy with accusation. One afternoon, he found her at the piano in the music room, playing the unfinished melody from her mother's journal. He leaned against the doorway, listening until the last note faded. "That melody," he said softly, "it feels like forgiveness." Ava looked up, eyes glistening. "It feels like coming home." The portrait of Gregory Whitfield was gone. In its place hung a painting of Celeste. Captured in soft brushstrokes, her eyes bright, her hands resting protectively over her heart, as if shielding the child within. Beneath it, a small frame held a photograph of Samuel Green, smiling gently under a willow tree. Guests and staff paused before it, some whispering, some weeping, all sensing the shift. The walls that had once held secrets now told the truth. The grand unveiling of the Celeste Green Foundation took place beneath clear skies. Guests arrived in simple clothes, not jewels. Musicians played in the courtyard. Children danced among the roses. Eleanor delivered her speech, voice unsteady but strong. "This is not a monument to sorrow," she said. "It is a promise that no one will be silenced for love." The crowd fell into reverent hush as Ava joined her at the podium. She did not speak long, just a few words. "I thought I was alone in the world. I was not. Thank you for proving that truth does not destroy families, it rebuilds them."
Applause rose like wind through the trees. Nathan stood among the guests, his gaze steady on Ava Pride, and something softer in his expression. Thomas stood behind Eleanor, one hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes shining. After the guests had gone and the lanterns were extinguished, Ava walked once more through the portrait gallery. She paused beneath Celeste's painting, fingers brushing the cool frame. She did not cry. Instead, she whispered, "I forgive you, and I will carry you forward." That night, she stepped into the garden, barefoot, the earth soft beneath her feet. Stars glittered above like scattered glass. Nathan appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of warm tea. Without a word, they sat on the cold stone steps, shoulder to shoulder, watching the moon rise over the hills. Its crescent shape glowed faint and familiar. "Do you think she can see us?" Nathan asked quietly. Ava smiled gently. "I think she never stopped." The wind stirred the roses. Petals lifted as if in reply. Somewhere inside the house, the piano began to play a soft, hopeful melody. One Ava had finished at last. Not an ending, a beginning. The Whitfield estate still bore its scars, but its halls no longer echoed with silence. They echoed with laughter, footsteps, music, and life. A legacy not of wealth or power, but of truth, love, and the courage to start again. The legacy of light.